Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something pretty complex.
Oh, absolutely. Always up for a challenge.
Okay, good. Because today, we're looking at the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
Quite a mouthful.
It is, right. We'll just call it CBAM.
Makes it easier.
So, can CBAM actually help the climate without, starting a trade war?
It's a big question.
Huge. And to tackle it, we've got a policy brief from CSIS,
Yes.
a breakdown from KPMG, and then we've got some perspectives from India.
Interesting.
Yeah, a piece from the Indian Express and an editorial from the Hindu newspaper.
Should give us a good range of viewpoints.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we get into all the potential drama, what exactly is CBAM? Why is the EU doing this?
Okay, so imagine you're a company in the EU, right? You're paying for your carbon emissions because of the EU's emissions trading system.
Right, playing by the rules.
Exactly. But then you've got competitors outside the EU, and they don't have those same costs.
So their stuff is cheaper.
Exactly. And the EU sees that as unfair and uneven playing field. Yeah, it's basically a tariff on the carbon emissions that are embedded in the goods imported into the EU.
So like a carbon tax, but for imports.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
And the goal is to encourage everyone to, get on board with stricter environmental standards.
Right. Incentivize countries to clean up their production processes.
If they don't.
Their products become more expensive in the EU.
Makes them less competitive.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But I could already see some countries getting a little nervous about this whole thing.
For sure.
What are the potential downsides? Are we going to see a bunch of trade disputes pop up because of this?
Yeah, the CSIS brief definitely brings up that concern.
Okay.
Some people argue that CBAM is protectionist,
Oh.
unfairly targeting countries with, weaker environmental regulations.
Interesting.
And then there's the risk of what they call carbon leakage.
Carbon leakage. What's that?
So what if companies just move their production to countries with, weaker rules?
Avoid the tariff.
Exactly. Then we're not actually reducing global emissions.
Just moving them around.
Yeah, like squeezing a balloon, the emissions just pop up somewhere else.
And speaking of getting squeezed, we've got those articles from India. The Indian Express and the Hindu.
Right.
They seem pretty focused on how developing countries are going to be affected by this.
Yeah, they're not exactly thrilled about CBAM.
No.
They see it as a burden, especially for industries like steel and aluminum.
Which are pretty key for their economies.
Exactly.
And their argument is that the EU isn't giving them enough time or support to adapt.
That's a big part of it.
And that it goes against, the whole idea of common but differentiated responsibilities.
Right. The idea that developed countries should take the lead in tackling climate change.
So India is seeing this as a bit of a slap in the face.
You could say that.
The Hindu article mentions something called equity-based accounting as a potential counter-argument.
Interesting concept.
What is that? Could it actually change things?
So equity-based accounting would basically take into account historical emissions and economic differences when calculating those carbon tariffs.
So countries that haven't contributed as much to the climate crisis wouldn't be hit as hard?
Right. It's a way to make the system fairer, considering different starting points.
So it's like recognizing that not everyone's starting the race from the same place?
Exactly.
But, how realistic is it that the EU would actually go for something like that?
It would be a big shift.
It would.
And it's not clear if the EU is willing to go that far.
Okay.
Their argument is that CBAM is already designed to be WTO compatible.
Ah, the WTO. Always got to bring them into the mix.
Right.
For those of us who don't speak fluent trade jargon, what is the WTO and why do they get a say in all of this?
Okay, so the WTO, the World Trade Organization, they're like the referee of global trade. They have all these rules that countries are supposed to follow to make sure things are fair.
To avoid, protectionist measures.
Exactly. So the worry is that CBAM could be seen as discriminatory.
How so?
Because it treats imported goods differently from goods made within the EU.
Ah, I see.
And if that's the case, it could face legal challenges.
Potentially even a trade war.
It's a possibility.
Okay, so we've got all these legal complexities to figure out.
For sure.
But before we get totally lost in the world of trade disputes, I want to circle back to the climate aspect of this.
Sure.
Is CBAM actually going to help reduce global emissions? Or is it just going to create a bunch of headaches without actually making a difference?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
The sectors covered by CBAM, things like steel, cement, fertilizers, they're big contributors to global emissions.
Right.
but they're only part of the picture.
Okay.
To really get to net zero, we have to address emissions from transportation, agriculture, so many other sectors.
So even if CBAM works perfectly, it's not a silver bullet.
Definitely not. It's one tool in the toolbox, and its success really depends on how companies and other countries respond.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah. Will it encourage them to invest in clean technologies, actually reduce their emissions?
Or will they find ways to, work around the system?
That's a possibility.
Or even worse, will it just shift those emissions to other parts of the world,
That's a valid concern.
making the problem even harder to solve in the long run?
Exactly. And it highlights the need for a more, global approach to climate action.
Yeah.
CBAM might be a step in the right direction, but it's not the end of the story.
We'll have to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely. Lots of potential for unintended consequences.
So much to think about. We've got the potential for trade wars, the whole issue of global equity,
Right.
and then the big question of whether CBAM will actually deliver on its climate promises.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a closer look at how CBAM is actually supposed to work in practice.
Good idea. Let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly. And then we'll explore how different players, businesses, governments, are preparing for this new reality.
Sounds good.
All right. Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into the world of CBAM.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
CBAM. It's definitely a game changer from what we've learned so far.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And as we kind of dig deeper into how CBAM actually works, practically,
Right.
I think it's important to think about the challenges businesses are going to face.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty then.
Mm.
What's the timeline here, and what should companies be doing right now to get ready?
Well, the clock is already ticking. The transitional phase starts this October.
Okay.
And it runs until the end of 2025. And during this time, importers have to start tracking and reporting their emissions.
So no financial penalties yet, but
Yeah.
they got to get their data in order.
Exactly. And that's where the KPMG report gets really interesting. They pointed that a lot of companies, especially smaller ones, they might not even have the systems they need to accurately track their carbon footprint.
So it's not just about following the new rules, it's about building a whole new way to collect and analyze data.
Yeah, pretty much. And KPMG actually suggests that companies should look at this as an opportunity, not just a burden.
Okay, I like that. Turn a compliance headache into a strategic advantage.
Right. By investing in these systems now, companies can really get a handle on their emissions.
Makes sense, but realistically, this is a big ask for a lot of businesses.
It is.
What kind of support is out there to help them through this?
Well, the KPMG report mentions a bunch of resources,
Yeah.
like there's guidance from government agencies, industry associations,
Okay,
and, of course, consulting firms.
of course.
But they also emphasize how important collaboration is,
Okay.
both within industries and between different industries.
So kind of like strength in numbers.
Exactly. Companies can learn from each other, share best practices.
Right, that makes sense. So let's fast forward then to 2026, when the financial penalties actually kick in. What does that mean for businesses, and how are they likely to react?
Well, according to KPMG, those cost increases could be pretty significant. It all depends on how carbon-intensive the goods are that they're importing.
Makes sense.
And that's going to lead to some tough choices, right?
Yeah.
They could try to absorb those costs, but that could hurt their profits.
Right.
Or they could pass the costs on to consumers.
Which could make their products less competitive.
Exactly. So it's a tricky situation.
Yeah, it sounds like a potential lose-lose.
It could be, unless they find ways to adapt. And the KPMG report outlines a few strategies.
Okay, what are they?
Well, they could try to find alternative suppliers, ones with a lower carbon footprint.
Okay.
They could invest in cleaner production processes themselves, reducing the emissions of their products.
Okay.
Or they could look into offsetting their emissions.
So investing in projects that capture or reduce carbon somewhere else.
Exactly.
So basically a mix of short-term fixes and longer-term investments
Yeah.
to become more resilient. But what about consumers in all this? Are we all just going to end up paying more for everything because of CBAM?
It's a valid concern, and it's something policymakers are thinking about, too.
Okay.
The goal is to encourage decarbonization without hurting consumers or disrupting global trade.
Right.
But finding that balance is tough.
It really is, especially with the economy the way it is right now.
Yeah.
People are already feeling the squeeze from inflation.
For sure.
Adding more costs on top of that could really backfire.
Yeah, it's a real risk,
Yeah.
which is why it's so important to get this right.
Makes sense.
CBAM needs to be implemented carefully, thoughtfully, with adjustments along the way.
So a lot of moving parts and a lot of room for things to go wrong.
Definitely.
Makes me wonder, are there any alternatives to CBAM?
Hmm.
Are there other ways to reach those climate goals without, risking a trade war?
That's a great question, and it's one that's being debated a lot right now.
Okay.
Some argue that a global carbon pricing system would be better,
Okay.
more effective, and more equitable,
Right.
but that's really hard to achieve politically.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Others think we should focus on helping developing countries decarbonize,
Okay.
through technology transfer and financial assistance.
So more of a carrot approach than a stick.
Exactly. And then there are those who believe that countries should just focus on their own climate policies
Okay.
rather than trying to regulate imports.
So a more inward-looking approach?
In a way, yeah. But the reality is, climate change is a global problem.
It is.
It needs global solutions. No one country can fix it on its own.
That's for sure. It feels like CBAM, whether we like it or not, is forcing a conversation
Yeah,
about how we approach this, this huge challenge.
absolutely. And those conversations are important, even if they're tough sometimes.
They are.
We need to be talking to each other, sharing ideas, working together to find solutions.
Okay, so we've talked about how CBAM works, the impact on businesses,
Right.
the bigger policy picture.
Uh-huh.
But I want to zoom out even more now
Okay.
and look at the really big picture.
Sounds good to me. Let's connect the dots.
What does CBAM tell us about the future relationship between trade and sustainability? Is this the start of a new era where environmental concerns are, front and center in global commerce?
I think it's a sign of things to come.
Yeah.
For a long time, trade and sustainability were seen as separate issues,
Right.
sometimes even conflicting. But CBAM suggests those lines are getting blurry.
So instead of that old jobs versus the environment debate,
Uh-huh.
we're moving toward a more integrated approach
I think so.
where sustainability is seen as part of economic competitiveness.
Exactly. And that shift is being driven by a few things,
Aye.
consumer demand for sustainable products, investor pressure on companies to be more environmentally responsible,
Okay.
and of course, the urgency of the climate crisis.
Right. So it's not just about being nice, it's about recognizing that sustainability is good for business in the long run.
Exactly. And CBAM, with all its complexities, is pushing that shift forward. It's telling businesses they need to take their carbon footprint seriously if they want to stay competitive.
So a wake-up call, even for companies that aren't directly affected by CBAM.
Absolutely. The message is clear. Sustainability is not optional anymore. It's essential for any business strategy in the 21st century.
A new era of climate-conscious trade is upon us.
It seems like it.
But how do we make sure this is fair, especially for developing countries?
That's the big question, and it's going to require constant dialogue, collaboration, and new ideas.
Okay.
We need to find ways to help developing countries transition to cleaner economies
Right.
without holding them back or placing unfair burdens.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is, and it requires a change in how we think, both in developed and developing countries.
Okay.
We have to move away from that us versus them mentality.
And toward a more collaborative approach.
Exactly. Recognizing that we're all in this together.
The climate crisis is a global problem.
It is.
It needs global solutions.
Exactly. We need to work together, share resources, support each other's efforts to build a more sustainable future.
Well said. But before we get too idealistic, let's bring it back down to earth for a minute.
All right.
We've talked a lot about the theory behind CBAM,
Yeah.
but what's actually happening out there in the real world? How are companies getting ready for this? What are the real challenges and opportunities?
That's a great question, and it's the perfect lead-in to our final part,
Right.
where we'll look at specific examples and see how different players are navigating the uncharted waters of CBAM.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It's time for the final part of our CBAM exploration.
And it's where things get real,
Exactly. We've talked theory. Now let's see how CBAM is actually playing out for businesses and industries.
The nitty-gritty, right?
Okay, so first up, those industries directly in CBAM sites, steel, cement, fertilizers, aluminum, what are they doing to get ready?
Well, the KPMG report highlights a few things. Some companies are getting more efficient, trying to reduce how much carbon they emit for each thing they produce.
So lowering their carbon footprint to avoid those tariffs.
Right, and they're realizing that being a low-carbon producer is becoming like a competitive edge.
Makes sense. But what about companies that can't easily change their processes? Are they just stuck with a big carbon bill?
Not necessarily. The KPMG report says some are looking for new suppliers.
Oh, okay.
Like, steelmakers might switch to iron ore suppliers with lower emissions.
Interesting. So this could actually change global supply chains.
Potentially, yeah. It could benefit companies in countries that already have stricter environmental rules.
A win for those already playing it green, huh? But this also makes transparency really important, right?
Absolutely. Companies need to prove their product's carbon footprint with solid data if they want to dodge those tariffs.
Data's like gold in this new climate-conscious world. But what about companies not directly covered by CBAM? Can they just chill?
I wouldn't advise that. CBAM is sending a message, whether you're immediately affected or not,
What message?
that the rules are changing. Sustainability isn't some side project anymore. It's central to how you do business.
So it's a ripple effect, making all companies think about their carbon footprint.
Exactly. And it's not just individual companies, it's whole industries. More and more, we're seeing industry groups setting their own decarbonization standards.
Like self-regulation to stay ahead of the game.
Kind of, yeah. They're realizing it's better to take charge than have rules forced upon them.
Smart move. But what about governments? We've talked about the EU leading the charge. How are other countries reacting to CBAM?
It's a mixed bag. Some, like the U.S., are thinking about their own WN border adjustments.
Okay.
Others are beefing up their domestic climate policies so they don't get hit by CBAM. And there's this growing call for everyone to work together.
To create a level playing field, avoid a carbon pricing free-for-all.
Exactly.
So, lots of figuring things out as we go, huh?
Definitely. And that's where the geopolitics get interesting. It's not just about economics anymore. It's about global power dynamics.
Oh, wow. Like, who has the leverage in this climate-conscious world?
You could say that, but let's not forget, a lot of this arrest driven by genuine concern about the climate. CBAM might have its flaws, but it shows how urgent this issue is.
So it's a mix of self-interest and wanting to save the planet.
Pretty much. And that makes it both fascinating and super challenging.
Agreed. It feels like the journey's just beginning. CBAM is a change maker, but it's not the finish line.
Exactly. We're in a new world now where sustainability and trade are inseparable.
And how we handle this will shape our economy and the planet's future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, huge thanks for joining us on this deep dive into CBAM. Really insightful conversation.
It's been a pleasure. And to you, our listener, we hope this has sparked your own thinking about trade, sustainability, and the future we're building together.